Okay, this is a video about the first part of the lesson on new functions and greater diversity in the rural areas at world level. So in class we've already done a long introduction defining rural areas as places characterized by low densities of activities, people and buildings, and greater presence of vegetal landscape. We also evoke the fact that diversity already exists among rural areas depending on climate, proximity to cities or levels of development, but that this diversity was getting greater with the modern economic trends, and doing the same about the people living in the countryside, the rural societies. We define them as traditionally quite different from urban ones, more close-knit communities with strong identity, lower levels of social diversity, but that these societies were also changing in relation with the economic trends. So this video will be about a first part in the lesson, a part entitled The World of Farming, which is a title that evokes two dimensions. First of all, the fact that indeed rural areas are to a large extent the areas dedicated to farming in many countries of the world, not to say all of them, and also because this first part will be a study of the various forms of a farming system that exist all over the world. And the first idea will be about the fact that in the world population, many of us are still farmers, even though there is a trend of modernization which has impacted a lot the importance of farmers among all the workers that exist in the world population. So I start with this picture of the world, which consists greatly of green areas, and indeed the first idea would be that almost all of the world land is rural technically. Cities by definition are places of concentration, and so in terms of surface and size, the truth is that they represent only a very small part of the lands of the world. On all the rural areas in the world, only approximately 40% consists in farmlands, which means that 60% of rural areas are dedicated to natural spaces. And among these farmlands of the world, 1/3 of the farmlands are cultivated fields, and 2/3 of the farmlands are meadows, that is to say pastures dedicated to feeding animals. The population in rural areas represents approximately 3.4 billion people, and it's now less than 50% of the world, which is a shift that was pretty recent. The urban population has overtaken the rural population only about 15 years ago approximately. And so for the last 2 centuries, in fact, starting in Europe, there has been a decline in the share of the rural population, for sure, but at world level, the rural population has never decreased in number, which is of course due to population growth, and also to the fact that all the world was not affected at the same moment by the trends of economic modernization, in other words, industrialization, and that's in large areas of the world, notably in Asia, in Africa, South America. Well, the importance of farming in the economy has remained great up to a very recent time. So we see that in real numbers, the rural population of the world seems to have reached a peak and will probably start to decline by the middle of the century because population growth is also slowing down, notably in Asia. Population growth is in fact only really important in Africa nowadays. And because the migration from rural areas to cities, which is what we call the rural flight, and we studied that in history for Europe 200 years ago, this rural flight is still on the way in Asia and in Africa. But the share of farmers and this map is in fact about what I've just said, which is the fact that we have an uneven situation on the demographic trend in the rural areas. On this map, you can say that in all the countries which appear in pink, the population in rural areas has already been declining for a couple of years. But that in others, and in particular Africa and South Asia, the population in rural areas is still increasing, and for a couple of countries, notably in Africa, this increase is still rather fast. Okay. So that's just the geographic illustration of what I've presented. Now the new graph, which is exactly about employment, and more exactly the share of total employment, all the jobs that exist in the world, which are jobs in agriculture. And we can see a very clear decreasing trend, because since the beginning of the 1990s, so for the last 30 years, the share of farmers in the labor force structures of the world has constantly declined, passing from 44% of the global labor force. So 30 years ago there was still almost half of the workers in the world which were farmers, and it is nowadays less than 30%, about 28%. So the trend is really clear, and obviously this decrease is not over. But on this map, which is a recent map, we can see the share of farmers in the labor force of each country, and we can see here very clear contrasts and real gaps between the situation of developed countries like those of North America or Western Europe, where the share of farmers in the labor force is below 5%, and countries of much less developed areas, so notably South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where you can still find countries where more than half of the working population is still employed in agriculture. And this level of farmers in the labor force is consequently strongly linked with the level of economic development. And that's what we are going to be looking at in part B. We will see that depending on on the country, we will find a dominant farming system which can be very contrasted from one place to another. So that's part B, diverse and unequal farming systems. There are huge gaps in the productivity of farmers in the world, and a wide range of types of agriculture. But basically, we will make a difference between two great categories of agriculture. The intensive and commercial farming, which is the form of agriculture which is widely dominant in rich countries like France or the UK. And later, the opposite, the extensive subsistence farming. So you have two adjectives in this expression, intensive and commercial. They do not mean the same thing, but eventually, in reality, these two characteristics of farming are quite strongly connected. Commercial farming basically means that most of what a farmer produces is sold on a market, which is the situation of most farmers today who are professionals. To be a farmer is their job, and they do not directly consume most of what they produce. They sell it, often because they are specialized in a limited number of activities, either livestock, for example, or growing cereals or growing fruits, for example. The opposite of commercial farming is subsistence farming. It's when most of what a farmer produces is actually directly consumed by the family. Intensive refers to something a bit different. Intensive refers to the technique, the range of techniques that the farmer is using. And fundamentally, if it is an intensive technique, it means that the farmer strongly modifies the natural environment in his activity. He will modify the environment through a lot of labor, a lot of what we call inputs, for example, the pesticides that kill the insects, or the fertilizers that help plants to grow faster and stronger. In other words, a very intensive form of farming is a form of farming where a lot of capital, a lot of money, is invested in the activity. The opposite being extensive farming, when cultivation or any other form of farming is done without modifying too much the natural environment, which is better for the environment, but obviously much less productive. So here are a couple of pictures of intensive commercial farming. Here, some of them may be surprising. This is a flower farm from the Netherlands. The Netherlands really has a specialty in flower farming, exporting all over the world and really controlling this market at world level. Of course, there are also flower farms in other countries of the world, including in African countries these days, but in fact they are often owned by European people. And yes, well, obviously there is nothing natural in this landscape. We can see very straight ranges of flowers, and it is obvious that this landscape shows many signs of human activity with these straight lines. Another very famous example is on a large scale the production of cereals with modern techniques, which is really dominant in all Western Europe, also the USA, and in a country like Brazil, often seen as one of the farms on the world, between inverted commas. So here's a very not iconic, but a very clear example as a picture of some combined harvesters. This is how you call these machines, these vehicles, who are harvesting a very large wheat field in Brazil. This is also pretty intense. When water is artificially transported to the fields, this is obviously a form of great intensiveness because you modify the environment, and it often creates specific landscapes. Here you can see these circular and squared shapes of fields seen from the sky in Kansas, USA. It's because the shape of these fields is the result of the sprinklers that are used for irrigation, and some of them are rotative, so that's the reason why they do circles like this. And this is another surprising view from Google Earth. We are in the south of Spain, in the region of Andalusia. This is the coastline, this is the Mediterranean, and we are near the city of Almeria. And what you see in white on this rather vast zone, which is imprisoned between the mountain and the motorway and the sea, is actually a large number of greenhouses. And the greenhouses, which aim to create artificially some environmental characteristics, notably heat and humidity at all seasons in the year, are a very good example of intensive farming. In Andalusia, many vegetables and fruits, notably tropical fruits, are produced, and in particular, many of the lemons that we, or oranges that we eat in Europe, are made in Andalusia in this very artificial way. And another famous or infamous landscape that we can see is about another aspect of farming, which is livestock, which means raising animals. Here you have an example of what we sometimes call a mega farm for chicken. It's in Britain, but there are many of these in rich countries where chicken are raised in an absolutely unnatural way. It's very intensive, and it looks more like a big factory than actually a traditional farm. So all these examples of intensive farming are examples of the type of systems which are dominant in the rich countries. On this map, they will appear in dark green all over North America and Europe, but the areas in blue for Mediterranean agriculture, the example of Andalusia, for example, is also intensive commercial farming. You also have the commercial plantation agriculture in red, which exists also in poorer countries, but exported all over the world. And well, obviously, in terms of land surface, intensive commercial farming dominates the world, because thanks to modern techniques, thanks to machines, a couple of farmers, not a couple, but a rather small number of farmers can produce crops and food for many people. The other colors on this map, notably the light ones, the yellow ones, represent forms of extensive subsistence farming, and as you can see, they are really dominant in Central Africa in particular. Let's have a look at this form of extensive farming. So as I said already, it's the opposite of intensive. So it's when farmers use very limited technology and can invest very little capital in their activity. So they will also be more traditional. In fact, for most of the history of mankind, extensive subsistence farming has dominated, and that is the reason why you have in some countries such a high share of farmers in the labor force. It's because they are not productive, and for many of them they are not even selling most of their crops. they are mostly consuming it. That is the most traditional and on the in a way the lowest way to make a living, not low in any moral judgment, of course, but the one of the less value-added activity in the world. Some of the poorest people in the world are poor farmers, actually. So here you have a picture of father and son working in the activity of plowing with a horse, which already shows a certain level of wealth by the standards that exist in a country like Chad. Here you can see in Ethiopia some farmers harvesting cereals. And here you can see rice harvesting activity in Asia, which is a manual activity. Obviously, it is not very productive in the sense that each farmer here, each woman is not very productive, but it is true that it's difficult to call it an extensive form of farming because the land is modified a lot, notably with irrigation. That is the reason why I have put extensive between brackets here, and that on the map later you will see it in very dark orange, I think. Look at this picture, this landscape from Indonesia with the terraced rice fields. Obviously, this is a very modified and man-made landscape, so you can't call that extensive, really. But these rice farms are often subsistence. I mean, it's often to feed, if not the family, at least only the local community, which is the reason why on this map Asia is represented largely as an area of intensive subsistence agriculture, which is a reference to rice farming mostly. And in part C, I've entitled it The Plight of Farmers, because I would like to talk about the fact that in poor countries, but also in rich countries, many farmers are facing great economic difficulties. And even if you can see some farmers who look pretty rich, notably when we see these machines, as opposed to what are the working conditions of subsistence farmers in Central Africa. The income that a farmer in France can receive at the end of the year tends to be tragically low. In fact, it is something that has been an object of information, debate, and artworks quite recently in France, because these past years there's been two movies, Petit Paysan and Au nom de la terre, the latter being particularly successful, who have illustrated this tragic situation of farmers even in France, despite being professionals, despite being very skilled, and sometimes be equipped with very modern machines. Well, it's not enough to make a decent living. And in fact, even if you are an intensive commercial farmer, even intensive commercial farmers are often working only at family level with very few employees, which is the kind of story which is being told in Au nom de la terre. 90% of the farms in the world are family-based, and they produce 80% of the crops in the world. And for most of them, being a farmer is not an activity which is economically successful. And here is the reason why. The reason why is that farmers are economic actors who can't work in a disconnected way from the rest of the economy. They have to sell to to somebody. Of course, you may say they have to sell to consumers. It's true, and they do. But direct selling from farmers to consumers remain pretty rare, notably in rich countries. In fact, most of the crops a farmer will produce will be sold to either the retailers, so the shops, but in majority supermarkets, for example Carrefour, which is a very big TNC, very rich, very powerful TNC, or they will sell some of it to restaurants, for example. And even though many restaurants in the world nowadays are facing very, very difficult time, we can say that some TNCs in this sector of the economy have also been successful. McDonald's, for example. And they often do some propaganda advertising, McDonald's or Carrefour, where they say that they work with farmers and all that. If they do that propaganda, it is because there's been a lot of blame put on them for the very low prices that they impose on farmers. And indeed, they can impose low prices on farmers because nowadays, in Europe, for example, we have no problem of productivity. In fact, we are mostly in a situation of overproduction for some products like milk, for example. So it's easy for big retailers to impose low prices on farmers because, in fact, they have no other choice than to sell their milk to somebody. And these are the economic actors that actually sell directly to the consumers, and they make money out of this service. And farmers will also sell to food processing companies. You know them, because there are industrial companies which transform the farming outputs into food. You know them, but maybe you do not know how big they are. Nestlé, for example, or Unilever are companies which in fact possess a lot of brands, and being very, very big companies, they can also impose low prices on individual farmers. All the farmers are in competition with one another, so a farmer cannot impose very high price because another farmer will sell at a lower price. That is the rule of the market, but this rule is not in favor of farmers. And in fact, by the way, in many developed countries like France, farmers are being helped. They are subsidized, which means that the governments or the European Union financially aids farmers. Even with these aids, it's still not enough. And the farmers, they must buy most of the input that they use for their activities. They must buy seeds, fertilizers and pesticides and machines to industrial companies. And some of them are extremely powerful, notably Monsanto for a long time has been the company specialized in seeds and pesticides, which was the most infamous in the world because of some scandals. And recently Monsanto has been purchased by an even bigger company from Germany called Bayer. They are extremely big and rich and powerful. Because if you want to do mechanized farming, you need to buy expensive machines in the first place. So farmers need to deal with banks and insurance companies. Insuring farmers has always been one of the important activities of banks in the first place, because it is not a very safe job, farming. It is not a very stable job. The weather or other events can really alter your production from one year to the next, and that's the reason why they need to pay a lot in insurances. And so farmers need to deal with these service companies, which are more big and powerful and rich than them. You know this bank, Crédit Agricole. Look at the name of this bank. Of course, it is linked to the fact that originally this bank was created in the 19th century with the service of providing money, loans, to farmers. That's the reason why it was called Crédit Agricole in the first place. Of course, today, this bank, which is one of the most powerful banks in the world, has diversified its activities a lot. And so all these actors are the suppliers. And so you see, this is a long chain of actors that work together, and this chain consists of all the actors which are involved in one way or another in the production and distribution of food. That's the reason why we call this group of actors and their relations the food supply chain. And you see with this chart, well, I hope you do, that farmers are only one kind of actors of this chain, and they are not powerful because they are alone and they are in competition with other farmers, and they are faced with very big companies who face much lower competition actually and have a much greater financial power. This is the reason why I have called this part the plight of farmers, and it leads me to this sad statement, which is that poverty is a major characteristic of rural population all over the world. In fact, 3/4 of the world poor live in rural areas.